The sky above the Baltic Sea was the color of cold steel on the morning of April 21st, 1943. Wind hissed across the surface of the water, carrying the distant rumble of engines, sharp, mechanical, and unmistakably German. At 7:42 a.m., a lone silhouette sliced through the low clouds, its wings angled sharply, its nose dipping just enough to show the black cross painted across the fuselage. A Messerschmitt Bf-109G, the newest variant Germany believed would secure air dominance. Inside the cockpit, the young pilot tightened his grip around the control stick. His name was Oberleutnant Franz Keller, a rising Luftwaffe ace whose kill count was growing almost too fast for the propaganda officers to photograph. But this flight wasn't for glory. It wasn't a patrol. It wasn't even a mission. It was a mistake waiting to happen. He didn't know it yet, but within the next hour, Keller would do something no German pilot had done before. He would deliver to the Allies a gift so valuable that intelligence chiefs would later describe it as equivalent to stealing an entire air doctrine, and he would do it by accident. The Messerschmitt bucked as wind slammed against its wings. Keller steadied it with the ease of a man who spent more time in the air than on the ground. At 24, he had already tasted everything war had to offer. Dogfights that turned into spirals of smoke, friends vanishing in explosions, and victories that felt emptier every time. But this morning, something felt wrong. The fuel gauge flickered, the radio crackled with static, and the horizon looked unfamiliar. Keller frowned. He cross-checked his compass. It made no sense. He should have been flying over German-controlled territory. Instead, the coastline below curved the wrong way. The shape of the land didn't match anything he knew. He leaned forward. That wasn't Pomerania. That was Sweden. Neutral territory. And crossing into it would change everything. He banked left sharply, trying to correct course, but a sudden cough from the Daimler-Benz engine made the entire fuselage shudder. Black smoke trailed from the exhaust ports. The oil pressure needle dropped like a stone. The Messerschmitt was dying. Keller's eyes widened as the propeller began to lose speed. He pushed the throttle forward. Nothing. He hit the primer. Still nothing. The engine wasn't just failing, it was surrendering. A harsh alarm filled the cockpit. Keller had seconds to decide, ditch in the freezing sea and risk death, or glide toward the nearest land, even if that land meant internment. Wind roared past the canopy as the fighter glided lower and lower. Below him, the Swedish coastline approached, gray rocks, dark pines, and the narrow inlet of Torslanda airfield. He whispered a curse under his breath. He was about to land a front-line Messerschmitt, complete with its newest engine, its newest supercharger, and its newest gun sight, on neutral soil. But the sky didn't care about politics. It cared only about physics. The wheels slammed onto the runway. The plane bounced once, twice, then screeched to a stop, drifting sideways in a cloud of dust. Swedish soldiers aimed rifles at the cockpit, shouting orders Keller didn't understand. He raised his hands anyway. The war had just changed, but to understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand who Franz Keller really was, and why the Messerschmitt he accidentally delivered would become one of the most closely studied aircraft of the entire war. Before the war, Keller had been nothing more than a quiet, sharp-eyed mechanic's son from Munich. He wasn't supposed to become a fighter ace. He wasn't charismatic. He didn't boast like the others. But what Keller had, what truly set him apart, was an almost unnatural understanding of machines. At age 10, he rebuilt his father's motorcycle engine. At 12, he fixed a gearbox that local mechanics said was impossible. At 15, he passed an aviation technical exam adults struggled with. He didn't just fly the BF-109. He understood it. He felt its vibrations, listened to its heartbeat, and knew exactly what it could do at the edge of a stall, in a dive, or under brutal G-forces. By 1942, his superiors were calling him the pilot who could see the wind. But the war was changing fast. Allied fighters were improving, radar nets were tightening, and Keller, like many German aces, felt the pressure building with every sortie. Every mission had fewer veterans, every briefing had more new faces, boys trained for only 60 hours. To Keller, it felt like flying inside a shrinking world. And on that cold April morning, the shrinking finally caught up to him. His route was incorrect, his bearings were flawed, and the engine failure that forced him down would become one of the greatest intelligence windfalls the Allies ever received. Within hours, Swedish officials photographed everything, every rivet, every weld, every serial number. They recorded the exact curve of the propeller blades, the cooling system design, the ammunition feed, even the calibration marks on the Revi gun sight. That alone would have been valuable. But what they discovered inside the engine cowling was something far more shocking. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. It helps me see how far these stories travel. Because in Part 2, we dive into the moment the Allies realized what Keller had delivered, a breakthrough so important that American engineers would later say it rewrote fighter tactics overnight. The Messerschmitt sat in the middle of the Swedish airfield like a captured predator, sleek, deadly, and completely out of place. Soldiers circled it with the anxious interest of men who knew they were looking at something they shouldn't touch. Mechanics photographed every angle, every seam, every panel line. Keller watched from inside a small wooden interrogation room, hands still trembling slightly from the forced landing. He expected shouting, accusations, threats. Instead, the Swedish officer across from him poured tea. "You are not a prisoner," the man said calmly. "But your aircraft must be studied." Keller closed his eyes. He knew exactly what studied meant. The Germans had drilled it into every pilot. If you must land, destroy the aircraft. If you cannot destroy it, burn it. If you cannot burn it, do not survive. But Keller had done none of those things. Outside, a mechanic ran his hand along the BF-109's cowling, stopping at the distinct bulge that housed the newest fuel-injected Daimler-Benz DB605 engine. A powerful, tightly engineered machine that gave the 109 its legendary climb and acceleration. For Sweden, a neutral nation surrounded by war, this was a treasure. For the Allies, if they could access the information, it was a miracle. Over the next 24 hours, word of the forced landing spread quietly across diplomatic channels. Sweden notified Germany, but they did so slowly, deliberately. They knew what they had in their hands. They knew what every nation wanted, and they knew America was listening. Across the Atlantic, at Wright Field in Ohio, U.S. Army Air Force's engineers stared at teletyped reports coming in from Stockholm. Measurements, diagrams, engine performance notes, even standardized ammunition loads. But the final message ignited the room. The aircraft includes the newest automatic engine management system. High-altitude performance exceptional. Supercharger efficiency exceeds expectation. One American colonel whispered the words, like he couldn't believe them. "They sent us the G variant?" A major shook his head. "No. They delivered it." Meanwhile, in Germany, panic erupted. When Keller's squadron reported him missing, high command assumed he had gone down in the sea. But then Sweden's diplomatic notice arrived. The pilot was alive, and the aircraft was intact. The reaction inside the Luftwaffe was instant outrage. A pilot had handed the enemy their newest frontline machine. Even if by accident, it was unacceptable. Within hours, Keller was branded a traitor behind closed doors. His family was questioned, his records sealed. Hitler himself demanded a full investigation. But Keller knew none of this. He sat alone, staring at the condensation forming on the tiny interrogation room window. Every few minutes, he pressed his fingers against the cold glass, thinking of the life that might collapse around him. And while he waited, the study of his aircraft intensified. Swedish engineers removed the propeller spinner, examining the wooden core reinforced with metal rings, an approach that shocked Allied observers. They pulled off inspection panels and found the new coolant radiator layout that allowed the Bf-109 to maintain speed in steep dives. They studied the leading-edge slats, automatic devices that gave the plane unmatched control at the edge of a stall. Every hour that passed revealed more secrets, but the Americans weren't satisfied with reports alone. They wanted the aircraft. So they sent a diplomatic team, quietly, discreetly, to negotiate an arrangement. Sweden could not simply hand over the plane. It would break neutrality, but they could share full engineering documentation at a price. And the price was simple: technical assistance, fuel credits, and spare parts for Sweden's own aircraft. The deal was accepted. Within weeks, a full set of blueprints, analysis reports, and flight data crossed the Atlantic. It was the closest the Allies ever came to getting a fully intact German fighter before the war ended. The impact was immediate. At Wright Field, American test pilots studied the Messerschmitt's quirks. They noted the torque pull on takeoff, the visibility issues from the narrow canopy, the engine's powerful low-altitude response, the climb rate that no Allied fighter could yet match. And then, they found something unexpected, something Keller himself had never been told. A weakness, a fatal one. The Bf-109's automatic mixture control system, while advanced, caused fuel starvation in steep negative-G maneuvers. Meaning, if a German pilot pushed the nose down suddenly to escape, the engine would sputter. Allied pilots could use this, and they would. But the biggest discovery wasn't about weakness, it was about philosophy. German engineers had designed the 109 around raw climb, tight turning, and high-altitude interception, perfect for hit-and-run attacks, not long-range escort fights. This revealed the Luftwaffe's entire strategic mindset. One American test conductor wrote, "This aircraft is not built for endurance. It is built to strike from above once. This tells us everything about their air doctrine." Suddenly, the failures of early Allied bombers made sense. They had been fighting the 109 the wrong way, playing to its strengths. But now, they knew its limits. With Keller's aircraft fully analyzed, American engineers reworked tactics. They adjusted supercharger systems on the P-47. They redesigned oil coolers on the P-51. They introduced new dive recovery flaps, new throttle response systems, and new gun sight calibrations, directly influenced by the captured data. Keller, meanwhile, faced a different battle. German diplomats arrived to question him. Their tone was cold, clipped, threatening beneath the surface. "Why did you not ditch? Why did you not destroy the aircraft? Why did you survive?" He answered truthfully. But truth wasn't what they wanted. One officer leaned forward, voice low. "You have done more damage to Germany with this landing than the enemy could with 1,000 aircraft." Keller looked down. He had known, deep inside, that his mistake would haunt him. But hearing it aloud struck him harder than any battlefield wound. He wasn't just stranded in a foreign land. He was condemned by his own. And yet, the war was not done reshaping his life, because soon the Allies would make the most aggressive use of the Messerschmitt's secrets, launching a coordinated shift in tactics that shocked the Luftwaffe. And this shift began with one deadly revelation. A German ace's accidental landing had given the Allies not just a fighter, but a roadmap to defeating it. In Part 3, you'll see how Keller's mistake ignited a chain reaction across the skies of Europe, one that turned dogfights into data-driven hunts and allowed Allied pilots to press an advantage they never knew they had. The skies over Europe were no longer the same. What began as a forced landing on a cold Swedish runway was now echoing violently across thousands of miles of airspace. Allied engineers had decoded the Messerschmitt's strengths and weaknesses, and those insights began flowing directly into fighter briefing rooms from England to Italy. But the real transformation happened in the air, far above the clouds, where the roar of engines drowned out fear and strategy collided with instinct. It started in early 1944. The 8th Air Force gathered its fighter groups for a new kind of briefing. Pilots expected the typical speech about altitude, escort patterns, and enemy sightings. Instead, a test pilot stepped forward and rolled out a massive diagram of a Bf-109G, the same variant Keller had landed. The room fell quiet. "This," the test pilot said, tapping the drawing, "is how you beat them." A murmur rippled across the room. American pilots had faced the 109 before. Many had lost friends to it. But never had they seen its secrets laid out so openly. The pilot pointed to the supercharger. "This unit enables them to climb fast. Don't follow a 109 straight up. Break off. Force him to level out, then hit him." He pointed to the engine mixture control. "This system starves the engine of fuel under negative G dives. When he goes down, you follow. He will hesitate. You won't." And then the final blow, the one that would turn dogfights upside down. Their turning radius tightens at low speeds because of these automatic leading-edge slats. So what do? You don't turn with them. You fight vertical. High-speed passes only. It was a revelation. The pilots looked at each other with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. For the first time in years, they had a way to break the 109's grip over the skies. The enemy ace was no longer invisible, no longer unpredictable, no longer invincible. And so, the transformation began. It was February 20th, 1944. Big week. The air vibrated with the sound of hundreds of bombers climbing toward their rendezvous point. Beneath them, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts roared into formation, their polished wings catching the faint morning sun. The sky was blue, but the air felt heavy, charged with a tension that came before every major operation. Then, the warning broke through the radios. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." German fighters dove in a perfect formation, sharp, disciplined, descending like steel hawks with their noses aimed directly at the bomber stream. Their engines screamed as they picked up speed. A year earlier, the Allies would have braced for impact, but today was different. Major Robert Gaines, leading a squadron of P-51s, didn't flinch. He tightened his harness, glanced at the enemy formation, and muttered, "Let's see if Keller really helped us." The fighters collided in a violent clash of speed and strategy. A Messerschmitt soared past Gaines's canopy, climbing hard and fast. The German pilot expected the American to follow him in the climb, because that was how Allied pilots always reacted. But Gaines remembered the briefing. He broke off. The German leveled out, confused, just as the Mustang looped around and came down on him with crushing speed. The Messerschmitt pilot tried to push the stick forward, diving away, but the engine coughed in protest. A split-second hesitation. That was all Gaines needed. The P-51's guns roared, and the Messerschmitt disintegrated in a burst of flame. Across the sky, the same pattern played out. American pilots no longer entered slow horizontal turns. They no longer chased 109s into climbs. They no longer lost speed in pointless maneuvers. Instead, they attacked with carefully controlled bursts of power and vertical dives, forcing the 109s into situations where their strengths became weaknesses. One German ace, after barely escaping a formation of Mustangs, reported, "They read our minds. They knew our every move." He was wrong. They had read Keller's airplane. Meanwhile, Keller, still interned in Sweden, learned about these battles only through whispers and scattered newspaper reports. He read of Allied breakthroughs, of new tactics, of German losses mounting in the skies. And though the reports didn't mention him directly, he could see the shadow of his mistake in every headline. One night, as he sat alone in his small barracks room, a guard approached him. "You should see this," the guard said, handing him a paper. Keller unfolded the front page. It detailed a massive air battle over Germany. Dozens of Luftwaffe fighters shot down, many before they even reached the bombers. His throat tightened. He knew why. He knew he had contributed to the very tactics now tearing through the Luftwaffe. The report described a maneuver pilots were calling the Keller Dive, though they didn't know the name came from the man who had unwillingly revealed the enemy's weakness. Allied pilots discovered that by pushing 109s downward, the German engines sputtered. They exploited it mercilessly. Keller closed his eyes. His hands shook. He wasn't a traitor, but he also wasn't innocent. War had turned him into a man whose single navigational mistake was now echoing across battlefields he would never see again. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. As U.S. engineers continued analyzing the Swedish reports, they uncovered something even more valuable: the 109's performance envelope, its exact speed, climb, dive limits, and stall characteristics. With this information, American tacticians created what they called disruption zones, altitudes and angles from which the 109 could not safely attack. Suddenly, bomber formations had safe corridors. Suddenly, escorts could predict enemy approaches. Suddenly, the sky became a chessboard, one the Allies finally knew how to play, and the results were deadly. In one fierce engagement above Frankfurt, a German squadron attempted a high-angle interception, expecting to dive through the bombers with overwhelming speed, but the Mustangs were waiting, positioned precisely where the Messerschmitts would stall out of their dive. 4 German fighters fell in less than 30 seconds. One Allied pilot later said, "It felt like we were inside their aircraft, like we knew what they were about to do before they did." He didn't know how right he was. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than they could replace them. The Allies weren't just winning dogfights, they were dismantling an entire air doctrine built over years of German experience. And all of it traced back to a single morning over the Baltic Sea. One wrong turn, one failing engine, one forced landing, and now the final blow was coming. The shift that would break the Luftwaffe entirely. In Part 4, we reveal the aftermath and the astonishing legacy Keller never expected to leave behind. The war was entering its final violent convulsions. Cities burned, factories fell silent, and skies once ruled by the Luftwaffe now echoed with the steady, confident hum of Allied aircraft. The balance had shifted so dramatically that even seasoned German aces admitted privately that their time was running out. Far from the firestorms consuming Europe, Franz Keller sat in a quiet Swedish dormitory room, staring at the frost on the window. Snowflakes drifted past the glass, like fragments of a world cracking under its own weight. Every morning he asked himself the same question. How could one mistake matter this much? He had been a pilot, a soldier following orders, fighting a war he didn't choose. And yet somewhere thousands of feet above the Baltic Sea, an engine sputter had turned him into a catalyst. A simple human accident had rewritten entire battle strategies. But Keller didn't know the full truth. Not yet. That truth arrived on a cold April afternoon in 1945 when a Swedish officer knocked on his door with an envelope. "It's from your embassy," the officer said. Keller hesitated. He hadn't heard from anyone in Germany for months. He opened the envelope slowly, half expecting news of his family, half fearing the condemnation that had haunted him since the day of the landing. But instead he found a single typed letter, brief, bureaucratic, and chilling. Because of his unauthorized landing, he was to be transferred to a temporary German detachment in Norway. Formal review pending, travel arranged. It didn't say the words. It didn't have to. He knew exactly what formal review meant. The Nazis were collapsing, but their internal purges continued. Pilots, officers, mechanics, anyone who embarrassed the regime was dealt with. His transfer was simply a slow, official way of removing a loose end. The officer watching him saw the color drain from Keller's face. "You don't have to go," he said carefully. "Sweden is neutral. We do not hand people over." Keller exhaled shakily. For the first time since his landing, he realized he was safe. Not because of politics, but because of humanity. Germany was falling apart. He could never return. He was officially stateless. But the war wasn't over yet. Across the Atlantic in Washington, American generals gathered around a final set of combat analyses. The numbers were staggering. In early 1944, Luftwaffe survivability remained strong. By mid-1944, after the Allies adopted the anti-Messerschmitt tactics born from Keller's landing, German fighter losses skyrocketed. Entire squadrons disappeared. Veteran aces died in battles they would have won a year earlier. And the U.S. had a detailed map explaining why. The Bf-109's operational envelope had been exposed. The German vertical climb neutralized. High-altitude dives countered. Low-speed maneuverability avoided. Fuel starvation under -G exploited mercilessly. But there was one more revelation that shaped the war's final act. Germany's entire air defense strategy relied on the 109's ability to intercept bombers at specific altitudes. With its weaknesses now charted, the Allies shifted their formations to altitudes and routes where the 109 performed poorly. Suddenly, bomber losses plummeted. Suddenly, the American air campaign accelerated. Suddenly, German cities and factories, once protected by a web of fighter doctrine, became exposed. One historian later wrote, "The Luftwaffe did not collapse from lack of aircraft. It collapsed from predictable aircraft." And that predictability began with the Swedish reports. Back in Sweden, Keller walked the quiet paths of the airfield where he had involuntarily changed the course of aviation. Snow crunched under his boots. He passed the spot where his Messerschmitt had skidded to a halt 2 years earlier. The fighter was long gone, returned to Germany in pieces after months of Swedish inspection, but the memory remained. He wondered about the pilots now facing off in the skies. He wondered how many young men, German, American, British, were alive or dead because of what happened here. He wondered if history would remember the truth, that he hadn't defected. He hadn't betrayed anyone. He had simply survived. War, however, doesn't care about intention. War has no patience for nuance. But history does. A few weeks later, Germany surrendered. Sweden informed Keller he could remain in the country under protected residence. He received a small stipend, a modest room, and a chance to rebuild a life that had been torn apart. He stated only one request: to work with machines again. The Swedish government obliged. Keller became a technician at an aviation maintenance facility, a quiet, almost anonymous position. But the mechanics quickly noticed something. He understood engines in a way no one else did. His hands moved with the precision of a man who had rebuilt machines under battlefield pressure. His insights saved hours of work, prevented errors, and even improved aircraft training procedures. He never bragged. He never mentioned his past. Most of his co-workers didn't know he had once been an ace. Fewer still knew the global significance of the aircraft he brought with him. For Keller, anonymity was a kind of peace. Years later, long after the war, American historians traced the technical intelligence that shaped mid-war tactics back to Sweden. And then, slowly, carefully, they found the name behind the aircraft's landing. Franz Keller, a man who changed the air war not through espionage or betrayal, but through the fragile, unpredictable human flaw of being lost at the wrong moment in a sky that demanded perfection. When asked, decades later, whether he regretted anything, Keller reportedly paused for a long time before answering. "I regret the war," he said softly, "but I do not regret living." He passed away quietly in the late 1970s, a man who left no children, no memoirs, no dramatic interviews. But aviation historians remember him as one of the most consequential accidental figures of World War II, a ghost whose single event redirected the lives of thousands of pilots. Because sometimes history is not shaped by generals, nor leaders, nor brilliant strategy. Sometimes it is shaped by a failing engine, a wrong compass heading, and a young pilot trying to stay alive. Keller's Messerschmitt didn't just land in Sweden. It landed in Allied briefing rooms, in engineering workshops, in the minds of every pilot who fought afterward. It changed tactics. It changed doctrine. It changed outcomes. It changed the entire air war. And somewhere in Sweden, an aging mechanic once looked up at the sky and whispered a question that no one else ever heard. Did it have to happen this way? History answered not with certainty, but with the strange, fragile truth. One man, one mistake, one moment, a new direction for the world.